The KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City area nonprofits and the people behind them. KC Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities. It's the place to be so that we can talk about making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. KC Cares is proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. Our founding fathers went to great lengths to ensure a separation of church and state, yet faith and government seem to intersect on many issues. While most people see the intersection as a contentious thing, there are always ways to work together for the greater good. And our guest today is going to talk about that. An organization that is focused on educating, engaging, and advocating on behalf of people of faith. It's Kansas Interfaith Action. And we welcome Rabbi Moti Reber, who's the executive director. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ruth.
Absolutely. All right. So with that introduction, tell us about what Kansas Interfaith Action is and how things work.
Okay. Well, the Kansas Interfaith Action is a statewide faith-based advocacy organization. That's the basic part of it. So we work on most primarily legislative issues in the Kansas legislature. So our mission focuses on four broad areas, which we call the four evils: racism, poverty, gun violence, and climate disruption. So basically anything that gets talked about in the legislature, we'll get involved with on those issues. We'll get involved with. Sometimes we propose legislation. Sometimes we oppose legislation. Kind of depends on the situation. We basically organize within communities of faith and the public who share sort of faith values in support of justice, broadly spoken. So racial justice, economic justice, et cetera. We are affiliated with several of the major mainline denominations, including the ELCA Lutheran Church and the Episcopalian Diocese of Kansas and the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the United Church of Christ and the Mercy and Justice team of the Great Plains Conference of the United Methodist Church. So we are the official policy office of the Lutheran Synod and speak on behalf of 60 Lutheran congregations in Topeka. So I'm a registered lobbyist. During the legislative session, I'm in Topeka advocating for the positions that we hold. For the rest of the year, I travel the state when that's possible, or do it via Zoom. Speaking to communities of faith and people who share faith values, trying to build support for the organization and also to build support for the positions that we hold.
You're a busy guy.
Mm-hmm.
Even though our legislature doesn't necessarily meet year-round, although it seems to be more and more that they meet year-round, whether they're in regular session or special session. If we can go back just a little bit, tell us the history of the beginning of Kansas Interfaith Action.
Well, we were initially a chapter of, we were a single issue climate change organization called Kansas Interfaith Power and Light. And that was from 2008 to 2015. And then in 2015, it became clear that, so when you think about, let me step back. When you think about faith and public policy in Kansas, it tends to be from the hard right. So abortion, anti-LGBT positions, evolution in schools. I mean, that's what people think about when they think about faith in Kansas. But that leaves out tens of thousands of people who share values that are faith values that are about tolerance and diversity and peace and love and justice. Those words were never spoken, and that position was never represented. So we reincorporated as Kansas Interfaith Action at the beginning of 2016 with a focus on bringing those time-honored faith values into the conversation in Kansas.
And how long have you been involved with the organization and its predecessor and this one?
I'm the founding director. Yeah, I wasn't the founding director of IPL, but I was the coordinator of IPL starting in 2011, and then I've been the founding director since 2016. So I've been there all along. I was on the founding board of IPL, but that's a long time ago now.
So I find it interesting, and I think for our audience as well, nonprofit leaders and people outside of nonprofits who work together. Can you talk to us a little about what it was like to kind of shift or broaden your mission, and how did you go about doing that? Not an easy task.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time, we were a single issue organization, so climate change is an extremely important issue, and it's still part of our mission today. However, there were a lot of issues that weren't being dealt with, and because there's no Council of Churches or other sort of statewide faith-based advocacy organization in Kansas, those positions were not being held. So we were seeing that the organization was going to lose some board members, and it was just a gap in Kansas politics. So we had a meeting. That was facilitated by a consultant, by a organizational consultant, and out of that meeting came the idea of becoming Kansas Interfaith Action. And we reincorporated. So we had to reincorporate because there was legal reasons. So we decided on a mission statement. The board bought into it. We announced it to our constituency, and starting in 2016, right away, in Kansas, the legislature starts the second week in January. So we announced this in January 1st, 2016, and then January 7th or whatever it was, we were right into the legislature. So it was pretty quick.
So you mentioned you were really the founder of this whole entity now, Kansas Interfaith Action.
Right.
Would you share with us a little bit your background and how you got to this? Some of our audience might go, what is a rabbi doing being a lobbyist?
Right. So I've always been politically active. I've always been politically aware. I used to work in sort of electoral politics back when I was younger. At some point, and also kind of advocacy, but not specifically what I'm doing now. I was always involved in climate work. I was involved when I was in seminary. I was involved in funding, public school funding. I was on a board of an organization that was doing public school funding. So I've always been engaged in that way. When I was in seminary, I worked for the denomination that I'm part of as a local regional director. So I had some organizational experience. When I got out of school, I had a pulpit in Illinois, and then I moved to Wichita. I've been in Kansas since 2007. I moved to Wichita to be the director of the Jewish Federation in Wichita, which is sort of the secular fundraising arm of the Jewish community. And the combination of, I think the combination of the rabbinical backgrounds, or the faith backgrounds, or that training, and then also my experience as an activist and in organizational work, all three of those things sort of came together. I was recruited to be on the board of IPL in 2008 as the Jewish representative on an interfaith steering committee. So that's how I got started specifically in this state, in this organization. But it's all of my experiences as a rabbi, as an educated Jew, as a activist, and as an organizational person, somebody with organizations in her background. All those three things together made me prepared for Kansas Interfaith Action to become what it wanted to become.
Well, I have to be frank with you. Living in the state of Kansas, our reputation across the country is not so, shall we say, maybe forward thinking at times. We're often considered, pardon me, more right, and we wouldn't be progressive in this thought.
Right.
How have you been able to deal with that and keep, your mission going, and hopefully not have people get stuck with maybe preconceived notions?
Well, the preconceived notions are not the issue. The issue is bringing enough kind of power to the table to be able to make legislative change. Examples of places where I mean, the prime example that we've been working on for the last several years is Medicaid expansion. So so just to take a step back and say, Kansas Interfaith Action works most effectively in coalitions with other groups because we have a niche profile and we're a small organization. Being the faith voice in a larger coalition is often the most effective way that we can act. So we've been in coalitions all the way along, including the Medicaid Expansion Coalition, an ongoing climate and energy coalition that we're still part of, voting rights coalitions, criminal justice reform coalitions. So that's the role that we play. It's very hard for us as a small organization to run a campaign that's going to have any traction just because we don't have the capacity, but we can be very effective in coalition with other organizations. So Medicaid expansion, unfortunately, we haven't passed it yet. We're still working on it, but it's a very mature, well-run, well-organized campaign that the Alliance for Healthy Kansas is the leader of, and then there's dozens of other organizations that are involved with it, including Kansas Interfaith Action. So it's basically trying to convince people that it's the right thing to do. Sometimes that's not enough, as we've seen with Medicaid expansion. I think in that particular case, there's a little bit of power politics that has not been tried or has not been effectively done. But a lot of times you're trying to, a lot of times we're playing defense, where something negative is happening and we're trying to water it down or defeat it. A lot of times we're trying to find edges or places where the partisanship is not implacable. So an example that we've been working on lately is payday loan reform. So that's a difficult issue because there's a lot of money on the side of the payday loan industry. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who see that as being a moral issue, because usury is forbidden by most of our religions. So you will see some possibility of shaking people loose from their preconceived notions or how you might expect them to act based on the moral framing of a particular issue. And that's often what we're trying to do is appeal, like I mentioned earlier, to the values that people hold, that the Bible tells us, of justice and mercy and peace, and tolerance and diversity, and all these other values that are so important. But bringing care for the stranger, care for the neighbor, trying to put those into practice. Sometimes that has an effect. Kind of depends on the issue.
Well, when we started our conversation, you had mentioned several faith organizations that are, I shouldn't say alignment, but in formal relationship with Kansas Interfaith Action. Can you tell us a little bit about how that all came together, and with a rabbi at the leadership?
Right. Well, it models interfaith, for one thing. So the first one and the most important relationship that we have is with the ELCA Lutheran Church. And we had to establish the organization. I mean, as I sort of said this before, but across the country, there are councils of churches. Oklahoma has the Council of Churches. That's ecumenical. So the terms of art here are ecumenical, means within the Christian community, across the Christian community. And then interfaith is everybody. So states have councils of churches. Kansas did not. The ELCA Lutheran Church has invested quite a bit of money in building public policy offices around the country. I think there's 15 or 20 of them. I'm not 100% sure, but some of them are offices of the diocese, of the synod, where they are. So they work for the bishop essentially, and some of them are, like we are, affiliated organizations. So Virginia has an interfaith public policy office that is also a state public policy office of the Lutheran Church. So to go back to your question, we had to establish Kansas Interfaith Action as a stable and effective organization before anybody would want to make a partnership with us. We didn't start from asking for partnerships. We started from doing the work. And as we did the work, it attracted people and we made these relationships. And the story of how that relationship was established was I did a table at their Synod Assembly at Bethany College in Lindsborg, and I met somebody who was very active in national ELCA advocacy, and he helped to facilitate the conversation with the Synod, and also the current bishop, who was Susan Candia, who was then the assistant bishop, also shepherded that conversation. And that took, probably about 6 months for it to come to fruition. But once that happened, it gave us a lot of credibility with the other denominations because they're in relationship with other denominations. And also they could see, nobody wants to get into the water first. They could see that that we were doing good work with the ELCA. And so they were willing to come aboard too. And it's a long conversation. The relationship with the Methodist Mercy and Justice team just happened. And I've been in this business for 10 years. 11 years, whatever it is. And, that just happened. So, it's kind of a constant ongoing process to engage congregations. But it's not only about the denominations, because the thing about the faith-based piece is that we don't only want we do want to engage people who belong to churches. That's very important. But we also want to engage people who sort of consider themselves post-church, who grew up in a church or a congregational setting. I should just say church all the time. Who grew up in a congregational setting, who were imbued with those values, who maintain those values, whether or not they go to congregate, whether or not they go to public worship. So that's very common. Congregations, organized religion now tends to skew older. The younger people don't necessarily go to church or synagogue. But they still can maintain those values. And we want them to know that even if they don't go to church, they're welcome to come to us as an expression of their spirituality. And that's another piece of this, is that people who are engaged in Kansas Interfaith Action see the struggle for justice as being an intrinsic part of their own spiritual development. That spiritual development is partially about your personal relationship with a higher power, but it's also partially about doing good work in the world. And we really give people an opportunity to bring that to fruition in their own lives. And oftentimes we're the main. We don't worship. We don't do organized worship together. We do interfaith services once in a while, but that's not the part that we're doing. What we're doing is bringing people who have shared values together in common purpose. To bring a little more justice into the world. And there's a lot of people who resonate with that and want to be involved with that, whether they're regular churchgoers or not.
Your organization, like many nonprofits, is focused on relationship building. So how can others engage with you? As you mentioned, you may be the place where there's a comfort level. So how do you do that?
Right. Well, one thing is that we do programming that people can engage with. We just had a panel about so-called critical race theory that's available on our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, if you look for Kansas Interfaith Action on Facebook, you'll find us. And the most recent video is this panel discussion we did last week about CRT. Which we're expecting to be a big focus for the right in the next legislative session. And we're trying to figure out ways to resist that. In the later September, early October, we have what we call a Faith and Public Policy Forum series, which I believe we'll be doing online. So earlier this year, we had a seminar on racial justice that was primarily for Lutherans and Episcopalians. So we do have programming that people can engage with. During the legislative session, we have many opportunities for people to get involved in communication with their legislator or in sort of activism with us. We have advocacy days. All of the coalitions that I mentioned all have their own advocacy days. So there's plenty of ways that people get engaged with that. I travel and our board members travel to give talks, whether that's a sermon or an adult ed, at congregations around the state. And then also we'll have public meetings to try to engage people in the work that we do. There's plenty of opportunities to be involved, and to be effective. But the best way to be effective is to sort of be on our mailing list, engage with the programming that we do, and stay in communication with us. We also have monthly chapter meetings. We're trying to extend our organizing a little bit more grassroots, and so we have 4 chapters to coincide with the 4 congressional districts. So each one of those has a meeting of an evening once a month, and all that information is available on our website, which is also kansasinterfaithaction.org. So, you can come and meet other activists and sort of get involved with doing programming locally. That's the way that we're a small organization. Up until about a couple of years ago, the only way you even know that we existed would be if you were within 3 feet of me. And that's not the way to do it. That's not a way to build the power that we need. So using the denominational mechanisms that we have available to us, and also the local chapter meeting model, is a way to expand our reach and to get more people engaged in the work that we do.
We're talking with Rabbi Mati Reber, who is the head of the Kansas Interfaith Action. All right, let's talk about briefly those 4 evils. So everybody knows on the table, and they're rooted in some of the civil rights movement by Dr. King.
Right. Yeah, Dr. King had what he called the 3 evils, which was racism, poverty, or materialism, kind of they're 2 sides of the same coin, and militarism. So he didn't know about climate change. It wasn't known at that time. So we believe he would have included it. As a matter of fact, somebody that we really look to contemporarily is Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. He's somebody who really we consider to be a direct descendant of Dr. King, and somebody who's really leading this kind of work in this generation. And he has several evils. He sort of has the same framework that we do, and it's racism and discrimination. So we oppose laws that would discriminate against anybody, really. Oftentimes it comes up in terms of LGBT people. LGBT issues are very they can be a little fraught in the faith community. There's very broad opinions on the subject, but where we've come to on it is that we don't believe that anybody should be legally discriminated against because of their identity. So we support non-discrimination ordinances around the state. We oppose the trans athlete bill that came up in the legislature last year because we feel like it's targeting individuals, and we find that to be wrong. Everybody, this is our kind of watchword. Everybody is created in the image of God. That comes from the Bible, and everybody has the right to equal protection under the law, and that comes from the law. So those 2 principles together are kind of how we look at things as Kansas Interfaith Action. So then, economic justice, poverty, making sure that people have what they need to survive and thrive. Kansas is actually pretty, Medicaid expansion being an example of that. That's a poverty issue. Gun violence, unfortunately, we've sort of lost a lot of ground on that issue. A lot of that's going to have to be done nationally because the politics of Kansas don't really seem very friendly to gun sense legislation, even though there's a lot of especially Moms Demand Action is a national organization with a state chapter that's very active. But right now we haven't been able to, even though there's been some change in Washington on this issue, at least on the margins. In Kansas, it's not changed at all. So we'll look for things like taking guns away from domestic violence perpetrators, like that sort of thing, or gun security laws, that sort of thing, to try to make red flag laws was something that Barbara Bollier had proposed when she was in the state Senate. And then climate disruption and climate and clean energy is still a major issue. And Kansas is a leader in clean energy. It has a huge amount of wind power, not so much solar. but also it still has this ideology of itself as an oil and gas state. And also there's most of the leadership, if they're not vocal climate deniers, as Senator Thompson is, then they're passive climate deniers, not willing to really do much about it. So that's, but we do have, we just joined a regional network called REAMP, REAMP, and they're a regional network that talks about equitable decarbonization. So decarbonizing our economy, but doing so in a way that doesn't leave the least of these behind. And that's something that we'll be working on quite a bit. I think that's a new formation for us. There's an organizing meeting this week, and I think that's going to be the focus of our climate and clean energy work over the next couple of years.
As a nonprofit leader, what would you say is your greatest challenge? And then your greatest piece of advice since you've really built this organization ground up?
Well, we just had a board retreat. We have our annual kind of self-assessment at this time of year before we go into the fall programming campaign. And we consider ourselves to be post-startup. So we're no longer a startup, but we're in what organizational kind of thinkers call the growth period. So 2 years ago, our biggest issue was having enough money to keep the doors open. That was a real challenge, even with only one staff person. Now we are in a position where we can keep the doors open at the moment. But it's a matter of building capacity. So the more active we get, and you can hear, we have a lot of issues that we work on. We have a lot of coalitions that we're in. It's very difficult. The more important we get, sort of the more vital we get, the less possible it is for one employee to do everything. So we need to build capacity in order to be able to live up to our own expectations of the role that we need to play. So we can sort of see, we just hired a half-time person who we can pay. And another interesting thing about the way that we work is a lot of nonprofits, particularly in the advocacy space, are single issue. And they get grants to work on like their particular issue, or they'll have a project that they work on. We are 75% of our funding is individual donations, and then contributions from our denominational partners or churches. So that goes to that doesn't have to be spent on a particular program. We're not bidding out work. We have our mission, and people are funding our mission, and that's the way we like it. Because that gives us flexibility, and it means that we can be responsive to what happens. But I think the major issue right now is, we have to have another couple of staff people in order to be able to do what we do more effectively. And I'd say over the course of the next year or two, I would expect us to basically double our budget and double our staff or triple our staff. That's our strategic plan right now.
And we thank you so much for your time today to share the good work that you're doing on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Ruth. Appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, and we're proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. If you'd like to be a guest on KC Cares or Underwriting Opportunities, please visit our website at kccaresonline.org and spread the love. You'll find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And catch us on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in to KC Cares.